everybody, welcome back to the next episode of Helix in the Studio, where I show some tips and tricks on how to get the most from your Line 6 Helix when using it to record in the studio, in our home studio, in a professional studio, wherever you might be. In the first couple episodes I covered using Helix as an audio interface and using Helix to reamp. Today I want to talk about a subject that I get a fair number of questions on, and that I also feel is really important to anybody who wants to make the most of their productions and get them sounding as good as they possibly can. And that is the idea of layering guitar parts when we're in the studio. A lot of folks who don't have any experience in the studio, a lot of times, and I've picked this up through my conversations with folks, they feel like they go in, they may have their drums, bass, and rhythm section down, and they go and they record their guitar. They play one part and they're done and off they go. And then they're like, I don't know why my production doesn't sound like, these professional productions that I'm used to listening to, right? And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. Now, having said that, there's nothing wrong with having a rhythm section with one guitar over it. Sometimes that's the perfect thing. So you got to always take everything I talk about here in context of how I'm referring to it. I'm never going to say that this is the only way to do things and that nobody should ever do it any other way. Sometimes the more simple the approach, the better, right? But that's not the topic today. The topic today is about making our productions sound bigger, wider, fuller, however you want to describe them. And we're going to do that by diving into guitar layering part 1. So let's go over to Cubase here, where I have a project open. Now I decided to use a project I recently worked on, and these are just small musical examples I've been doing to showcase some of my Line 6 Marketplace presets. I'm writing short snippets of music to let people hear what these tones sound like when used in the mix. So first things first, when I worked with this, I basically try to write a guitar riff that I like. Now this is for my Metal Through the Decades preset pack, which is available for Helix, HX Stomp, and Pod Go, actually. This is the Helix version. They're all very similar, mind you. And what I did is, let me just do this. I wrote this guitar riff, okay? Now, keep in mind, these guitar parts, these are totally unprocessed in the mix. I don't do any compression or EQ or anything to it. As you can see over here, there's no inserts on the guitar channels, there's no sends, it's just all from what the preset has given me and how I dialed it in on the Helix. Here is the riff that I wrote for this little piece of music. Okay, fine, you get the idea. So I came up with that very quickly. Then I said, well, what do I need to do? I need to go and make a drum and bass part to it. So I'll give my friends over at TuneTrack a little plug again. I use Superior Drummer, I used the Rock Foundry drum kit. Sounds amazing. And at that point, they hadn't put Easy Bass out yet, so I was still using IK Multimedia's Moto Bass, which I use their metal bass for. And what I came up with was this for my backing track. Okay, so you kind of hear how that would go along with the riff that I had written. All right, so here's what we want to do now. A lot of folks, when writing something like this, would very likely do something along these lines. And if you've noticed, my faders have moved here. I have a couple snapshots made up, and we do have snapshots also in Cubase, where you can take a picture of a mix. So if you notice what I did here is snapshot 1 has the drums and bass. Here's your Superior Drummer, here's your bass, here's my guitar 1, okay, set at -1. So I've brought that back where I felt it sat in the mix. One of the most important controls we have to get used to when recording is using the pan control or the panner, okay? If you notice right now, my drums are in stereo naturally. So when I pull up Superior Drummer, I can go to the mixer and you'll notice that the kick drum, here's the pan controls, is in the center. The snare drums are in the center as usual. The hi-hat is slightly off to the left. The rack tom's off to the left. Other one's off to the right, further to the right, further to the right. The ride cymbal's way over to the right. The overheads are panned left and right. So we're getting a stereo spectrum. So when we listen to just the drums, you know, you'll hear a cymbal over there, hear a cymbal over there, hi-hat slightly over here. When the ride comes in, I believe I use ride, I'm not sure. No, I just use some crashes. So. But you'll hear those placed in the stereo spectrum. Great. Bass guitar is up the center. It's mono. It's always going to be. Okay. Kind of MIDI sounding, but it was fine for this small snippet of music. So our pan control is going to allow us to place our instruments, in this case our guitar, anywhere in the stereo spectrum. Okay. So a lot of folks maybe don't realize, if they don't have experience, they put their guitars straight up the center, and there's a problem with that. Let's listen to what that sounds like with the one guitar part straight up the center, and then we'll discuss what the problem might be with that. Okay, it sounds all right, but there's so much more we can do with this to make our finished production so much better and so much bigger sounding, let's say. Or I don't want to use the word bigger, let's say wider sounding. Let's use that, okay? Because we're talking about stereo spectrum here. All right, so that's fine. Now, what happened there is we have the kick drum up the center, we have the snare drum up the center, we have the bass guitar up the center, and now we have a guitar up the center. In mixing, we can use EQ to kind of shape sounds so they don't sit on top of one another. And what I mean by that, let me give you an example. A guitar part, we may use a low cut, right? Or what's known as a high pass filter to cut out any frequencies below a certain point so that maybe the guitar doesn't step on the bass guitar. It kind of frees up the bass guitar frequencies and gets out of its way. So we can use EQ like that. I have that baked into this already in the Helix, where I've already done a low cut on it so that when it's used in the mix, it's going to sit better. So that's why I don't need to do any other processing in the mix. Now, that's not to say we couldn't. If somebody had this preset and wanted to EQ it different, they can absolutely do that because, hey, we want to be creative with things and we always have that ability. But it's not necessary. It works as it is. So the other way that we can move elements out of the way to allow other elements to sort of be noticed in the mix is using the pan control. Right now, like I said, we have kick, snare, bass, and guitar straight up the middle. Other than the drums, cymbals, and whatnot, giving it a stereo effect, we essentially have a mono mix here other than those little elements out in the stereo field. So one thing that's happening is the guitar now is almost in the way, not in the, as far as stereo imaging goes, with the kick and the snare and the bass. So one thing I can do, I'm going to play this again, and as I play it, I'm going to use my wheel on my mouse to roll this around. And what I want you to focus on is listen to sort of the middle of the stereo image and listen for your kick and snare and bass and sort of see how it opens up a space for them. Okay, let's listen to that. Did you notice that? So it kind of gives us a little bit of width to our our mix and opens up that center space for all those elements that are kind of expected to be there. Okay, so that's great. So we say, oh, awesome. Okay, so I'll just pan my guitars out a little bit. Obviously, if we go really extreme, if I was to go all the way to the left here, I like that because it allows the focus up the center to be on those important elements, kick, snare, bass, guitar of our rhythm section, right? So that guitar being out of the way is all right. Here's the problem though. The big problem is, let me see if I can bring up our stereo output here. So here's our stereo output. Watch my meters as I play this now though. Do you see how it's unbalanced in the meters? The left side is louder than the right side, and obviously because I have my guitar way over there. So that's no good. That's not going to help much out at all. So we want to have a more balanced stereo spectrum, right? So what we can do then is this is where the guitar layering comes in. Now, one thing we could do is simply come along and say, I'm going to duplicate that track. Now, what's kind of neat about Cubase is it goes guitar 1 and it puts a D next to it. So now I have a second version of that track. Now, if I just play those together, all that's going to do is make it louder. I haven't changed the tone, I haven't done anything to it. But what if I took that and I moved it to the right side? So opposite of where I had the original track. But really, that's not going to sound any different than if I just go. It sounds the same as just having it up the center because there's no difference between the two channels. Now, if I came in and did something on this channel, and let's say we'll add a delay here, and I'm going to use this PSP Audio Lexicon PSP 42. I'm going to set the feedback to 0. I'm going to set my output mix to 100%, but I'm going to bring my delay time down to, I don't know, maybe like 25 milliseconds, just a subtle delay, okay? I have my original guitar panned to the left. I duplicated it, panned it to the right, which is just making a mono recording again. But now if I offset this delay or this track on the right side by 25 milliseconds, they're now playing mildly out of sync, which will give us a wider sound, okay? So let's listen to it first with the delay bypassed, and then you see when it's yellow, it's bypassed. When I unbypass that, you should hear some width to the recording. Let's listen. You guys hear that? It widens the whole mix out and almost creates this space up the middle where the listener can be focused more on those elements up the middle while the guitars are on the outside. The tone of the guitar hasn't changed. It hasn't beefed it up or fattened it up. It's created a width in the mix, in the production, which makes the whole production sound better. Now, this type of stuff is going on in a large number of recordings we've heard over the years. This is a technique that's used a lot. Now, the setting we want on our delay is going to be up to us. As I play it again, let me adjust the millisecond time and see what it does. Obviously, the less I go, it's just gonna kind of make that less wide sounding. The more I go, it's gonna start to sound out of time. Okay, so let's listen again. You see up at those settings, it's just out of time. Even as small a setting as 1 millisecond though, listen. That's mono right now. Already, if you're listening, you gotta be listening on headphones will really help, but something, where you can hear the stereo spectrum, a decent set of speakers. Even that started to add some width, right? So do you hear how as soon as I turn that delay off, it collapses down to mono? When I turn it on, it creates a stereo mix of those two guitars. Let's listen again. Stereo. I don't think the guitars sound fatter or bigger or anything like that. That's not the point of this. It's to give it width and just give our whole production a wider sound that's going to be more pleasant to listen to, right? It ends up sounding bigger spatially, I find. Okay, so that's one way to do it. So if we're going to use a delay this way, we would want to make sure the feedback is set to 0 so that we're not getting a bunch of repeats. And we want to set our mix to 100% so we're not getting any of the original signal. It's going to be completely the delayed signal offset by however many milliseconds we have set it for. And that, again, you can adjust that to taste, right? Now, you don't have to use this particular delay plugin. It works, but we don't need it, okay? All right, so that's one way, but to be honest with you, that's not really my preferred way of working. At all, actually. I have used that, but I prefer to do something else. I prefer to do it kind of the old-fashioned manual way. Now, what I mean by that is I like to actually replay the same part again, then pan them left and right. Now you might say, well, why? That seems like a lot more work, you know? And obviously we have to have the ability to play the part very well, to lock in, you know, somewhat musically with what we were doing, but I'm assuming since we recorded the first part, we can do that with the second part. The reason is, I find it sounds more organic and more, just better overall. Simply because it doesn't matter how great a guitar player you are, how well you can play a part. It is humanly impossible to perfectly play that part exactly the same way each time. I may hit the volume of the strings, or my dynamics, we'd call it, right? I may be hitting harder or softer in certain spots. I may be playing slightly out of time, much like the delay was putting us out of time. But the delay is putting us out of time in a very static, fixed way, constant. When I'm playing it again, I can't but help to be less consistent and be mildly out of time in constantly varying ways, if that makes sense. Dynamics will be constantly varying. Now you might say, well, I don't want that. I want it to be perfect. I want it. And I say, no, my opinion is that I like those variations. We are humans, right? Humans we're not robots. We don't repeat things perfectly every time. And I think as humans, we also enjoy hearing that, you know? And a lot of new metal music, I find that that's why I can't maybe connect to it, is it's so robotic and everything is quantized to the grid and everything is perfect like it was played by a robot. And I find that tiresome after a while, but that's just my opinion. Other folks might enjoy it, and that's perfectly fine. But I like to play the part again. So what I've done here is I can play the part again. Let me go to Snapshot 2 here. Okay, so now I have a second guitar that played that part. Totally different performance. Okay, so here is performance 1. Here is performance 2. You'll hear there's slight discrepancies between them. You'll also notice something else, and this is an important point in the studio. I do not, and it's kind of an extension of my point I just made, I do not try and attain perfection in my performances. And that might sound really crazy, but I leave little warts and little what some people might think of as mistakes even. Not playing like the wrong notes, but just little things where, you know, that didn't come out as perfect as I want. I listen to it in the mix. If it works, I leave it alone. It's human quality. And I think in the end, those little things, warts and all, actually make out for a better production, if that makes any sense. So you've heard both performances by themselves. Now let's listen to both of those together, performed twice, then panned hard left and hard right. Here we go. All right, so let's listen again to the one guitar, and I'll switch the snapshot as I'm playing it. There is a little bit of a hiccup when it does that, but you'll get the idea. So this is the one guitar panned up the center, and then I'll put the two guitars together, panned hard left and right. If you notice, the guitar tone hasn't changed, but we have width to it now, and that's going to fit really well in our production. So what does that sound like if I put that in with the drums and bass? Sounding good, sounding great now. That's where I'm going to be happy with it. Let me go back and forth now. Again, we'll get this little hiccup in between, but let me go from one guitar panned up the center, and then I'll switch to the two different guitars, different performances, panned hard left and right. So here it is up the center, and watch when I switch. You can see on the monitor, okay, right in here. So you notice how we have more room up the center for our kick, our snare, our bass, and we have a nice width to our production now. Okay, so that's probably my number one tip as far as making your guitar sound nice and wide and making your production sound nice and wide when recording. Now, if you notice, there's another two tracks down here. Well, in this riff, I like those low harmonics, but I wanted to also have high harmonics. So I always think of how I can layer guitars to add complementary parts once I have my foundation set. So what I did is I went and I performed this. Just a different harmonic on top of. And I just brought that in the mix very subtly. And then as I used before with my technique, I doubled that and panned those hard left and right. So we get this. But again, you hear how it's a different performance, and it's those little imperfections that are going to make things sound better. Let's listen now. Now, here's the other thing. I have my overall level set at -1 for my main guitar parts. These two new guitar parts are set at -7.5. So interesting, much lower in the mix. Let's hear how that sounds mixed in there though. Now at this point is where the guitar solo comes in, and I go to my lead sound on the Metal Through the Decades modern metal sound. So let's just solo the lead guitar out. And you're going to hear something that the lead guitar has that no other guitar had. Did you pick it up? Delay. Okay, I always like to have a little bit of delay. It's subtle though. You hear those little repeats? I find that helps the lead guitars just sit in the mix better. Now, if you look at where that's panned, I have it slightly to the right. Now, I could have chose slightly to the left. Again, I want to move that out of the way of any potential problem areas, let's say. I want to move that out of the way of the kick, the snare, and the bass guitar. So it sort of takes up its own space, but I don't want it as far out as the other guitars that I put there, right? Something I could have done too with those little high harmonics is I could have pulled those in just a little bit more. I chose to go wider with them, but you can do whatever you want with them. And actually, let's do this. Let's pull those into maybe, you know, halfway back in on the right, and we'll hear what that sounds like. I just wanted to blend a little bit better with the original parts. Okay, so let's listen now to how this guitar solo sounds with the rest of the mix with that slight delay on it. And you can really hear the delay at the end. I found that sat very nicely in the mix. How loud we want it, well, that's going to be up to our own personal preference. But I'm really happy now with the way that sounded. Everything had its own space in the mix. Those guitars worked really nice, and we had a nice wide sound to it. So those are probably some of my top tips as far as layering guitars. And keep in mind, this is what I'm talking about here is in a more guitar-based mix, right? As soon as we add other elements in, pianos or strings or organ patches or, you know, synths, we're going to have to maybe think differently and create sonic space for everything. But in the case of this and just making our guitars sound better in our productions, these are some of the tips that are going to really work. I'm going to move over to a separate project now and show you a totally different style, but show you similar concept, but with a slight twist on it. Okay, be right back. So here I am back now with a project I just finished yesterday, actually. I haven't even released this yet. This is a demo for my Line 6 Marketplace Essex preset packs, which is a preset pack based off of the Vox style amp models that we have in the Helix. Now, I kind of created something that sounded sort of in the vein of an existing famous artist, but just to avoid copyright, I did my own thing with it. So what I started with was just one simple guitar part, and I just panned that up the center so you can hear what I started with. What I did is I panned that straight over to the left, okay? And that's how I wanted that to be. But I also created, again, in Superior Drummer, using their Decades, Al Schmidt Decades drum pack. Has a really cool sound. And I used their new Easy Bass, which is a very, very, very cool new instrument that I did a video on the other day to create the bass line. So here's what the rhythm section sounded like. So you get the idea. Now, what I did with this one is I wanted to be creative. I wanted, for artistic reasons, that rhythm section to have a single guitar at the beginning, panned straight to the left and left. Now, in the last lesson that we just talked about with the previous project, I was saying, well, that's going to create an imbalance of volume between the two sides of the stereo spectrum. And that's true, but sometimes for what I like to feel is a short period of time, we can get away with that for creative purposes and then maybe bring another guitar in. So let's hear what that sounds like with the one guitar panned to the left by itself with the drums and the bass. Now, if you notice, for 4 bars, I left it like that, and then after 4 bars, I brought in a part that I have panned to the right side, which I muted out there to hide from you right now. In the last example, I doubled the guitar with the exact same part, just to get a big wide sound. But sometimes when we're panned out like that and we start layering guitars, we can put a complementary part, maybe not the identical thing, obviously something that's going to work together musically. So in this case, what I did is I did the same chord progression, but with higher versions of chords. Let's listen to just that. that's also going to give us width, but it's going to give us a more interesting musical idea as well. So let's listen now to both left and right guitars, and you'll hear how one are the lower chords, one are the higher version of the chords. I really like that, and I found that worked really well. So let's listen to that with the drums and bass. What do you guys think of that? I really like the way that came together. So that's another technique. Same sort of principles as we talked about before, creating a width in our production, but this time keeping things even more musically interesting. We're not going to get that big wall of sound like we did in the metal version, but that's maybe not what we want here. I could have just gone and doubled this up with the same part and it would have worked. It would have sounded great, but I kind of like this, and it showcased the preset in a different way as well, which is kind of nice. Now, if you notice again, there's no delay. There's some nice reverb on those sounds. Which is helping it sit in the mix. But I never put delay. If I put delay on the rhythm, and I'm not saying you can't, if there's could be creative reasons why you'd want to, but when we put delay on the rhythm, we run the risk of potentially making the whole mix sound sloppy, where we have things bouncing around in and out of time. The other important point that I didn't mention when I was talking about the delay in the metal example is that I always time my delays to the tempo of the song. You see down here, this is 83.1 beats per minute. I time that to the tempo of the song. I set my delay at 83 beats per minute, whether it be eighth notes, quarter notes, whatever. I want that to sit better in the mix because those delays, echoes are going to sort of blend a little bit better in the mix. That's just a tip that I like to use. So again, what we do have here though is I bring a lead part in to showcase the lead snapshot of this preset. And again, you'll notice there's quite a big delay on this. But you will notice again, if I put just the drums in with that, you'll hear how those delay echoes are timed with the song. Do you hear how they fit perfectly? That's going to make a huge difference in the final mix. Let's listen to all of that together. And again, if you notice, I have my lead guitar panned slightly over to the right, okay? And here's what that sounded like in the mix. And you hear that delay trail off. Now, if you notice, what sounded like a really big delay when put in the mix, actually, listen in these spaces here where the delay should really kind of be more noticeable. Listen again, soloed. Very noticeable there. When I go in the mix, you'll just hear them help it to sit in the mix. So here's our entire mix of this, starting with the one guitar panned off to the left, the other guitar introduced on the right, totally separate part, and then to cap everything off, the lead part. Here it is. guys think? I think it worked out pretty good. Okay. So that's how I approach the idea of layering guitars. This is part one. I'm going to do a part two to this because there's other ideas that I use quite often, but I wanted to stick this episode to just that one concept that I think if folks who haven't been implementing ideas like this, if you do implement this into your recordings, absolutely 100%, I think you're going to see a huge improvement in your productions and in the sounds that you are getting. Now, a lot of folks may ask me about using doubler plugins and like the double take in the Helix. I've never been a fan for some reason. Every time I've tried them, and I've tried them, they always sound kind of artificial to me. I'd almost rather just slap a delay in place of it. And that's a video I will likely do soon in the Helix. With the Helix, maybe in a dialing in video or whatnot. But, you know, I find that the doublers don't really do, for whatever reason, what I've wanted them to do. I much prefer, like I mentioned before, just performing things twice in the studio. Obviously live, you can't do that. So there are some workarounds there. But definitely, I think if anybody who never followed these ideas before does so in their new productions, you're going to see I hope an improvement in something you like, and hopefully this even just sparked some new ideas for you to maybe try in some of your recordings and productions. Thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you for tuning in. Those tones you heard are all available in the Line 6 Marketplace. Like I said, the Metal Through the Decades preset pack for Podgo, for Helix, for Stomp, and also the Essex preset pack, which is available for Helix. That's the tones you heard, completely unprocessed. All the delays and everything you heard were right from that preset. So again, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. I will be back soon with some more content. And for now, stay safe and stay well. And ciao for now.